What's going on, Headliner Nation? Welcome back to the Fantasy Headliners, and I've got another bonus episode for you this week. Last week, I talked about different players that you should be targeting in trades if you're looking to improve your team. This week, we're going to be talking about some players that you should be looking to move if you own them. Now, the next minute of this video is very important, so don't just start skipping to the players. I need you to hear me out. It is very, very important that you understand that I am not telling you to run out and trade these players for pennies on the dollar, all right? There's a little saying that I like to use in fantasy football, and it's that I'm not trading a dollar for 4 quarters. And the reason I say that is because, yes, one of these guys, if you own them, you could trade them off, and you could get 4 guys that maybe equal that value. But don't trade one superstar for a bunch of depth because you might not even end up using all of those players. Yeah, maybe those 4 players will end up making the same amount of points that this one guy would, but what are the other options that you have on your bench that you won't be playing now that you've traded for these other guys? You got to be really careful with this, all right? Don't go out there and just unload a superstar for mediocre players because the schedule is difficult or because there's something that concerns you. You need to get the best deal possible. And I'll mention a couple of those things while I'm going through the video, but keep that in mind as we talk about some of these players, and you'll be probably a little bit shocked. I've got some pretty big names here that we're going to talk about that you may not have considered before this. So let's go ahead and jump into it, and let's talk about the first 2 options that I have at wide receiver, Adam Thielen and Justin Jefferson. Now, Adam Thielen and Justin Jefferson have performed extremely well so far this year. So, if you own either of these guys, more than likely you've been pretty happy with their performances. However, for Adam Thielen, it's kind of come down a little bit over the last couple of weeks. And maybe that's one thing that should be concerning you. So he had pretty big games in week 4 and week 5. 10 targets and 13 targets, 8 for 114, 9 for 80, 3 touchdowns between those 2 games. Then week 6, he has 5 targets, only 5 targets, 3 receptions, 51 yards, and a touchdown. Not too bad. But then 2 weeks ago in week 8, 4, 3, 27, and this past week in week 9, 5, 2, and 38. Now, the biggest problem with Adam Thielen and Justin Jefferson coming up is their schedule to finish the season. They get the Chicago Bears twice, they get the Carolina Panthers, and they get the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. All 3 of those teams are in the top 10 of fewest fantasy points allowed to opposing wide receivers. So now you're getting a guy in Adam Thielen that is trending down, and you're getting a tough matchup coming up, multiple tough matchups coming up on top of that. Now, the good news is sandwiching those as he gets Dallas in week 11, okay? Dallas should be a pretty good matchup for him. So maybe this week you wait, let him face Chicago because he's already struggling a little bit. Let him have a big game against Dallas and then try to move him at that point. One of the reasons that the volume has been down so much recently, though, is because obviously Justin Jefferson, he has started to break out a little bit more, and the usage of Dalvin Cook. They are running the ball like crazy with Dalvin Cook right now. One of the best running backs, if not the best running backs in the league right now based on statistics. But with Justin Jefferson, kind of the same thing. 4.326, 4.364 the last couple of weeks. And that was after that huge performance back in week 6 against Atlanta, where he had 11 targets, 9 receptions, 166 yards, and 2 touchdowns. So again, with both of these guys, maybe right this second isn't the best time to move them, but you're probably going to want to do it sooner rather than later, because not only that, if you make it into the playoffs are going to be quite a walk as well because of those matchups we talked about. One with Tampa Bay comes in week 14, and one with Chicago comes in week 15. So now of those top 10 matchups and fewest fantasy points per game, 2 of those are going to be within the playoffs. So if you make it to the playoffs, putting Adam Thielen and Justin Jefferson into your lineup could end up being a struggle for you because the upside, the ceiling may or may not be there. Moving on from 2 wide receivers to another wide receiver, Mr. Calvin Ridley. This one may be a little bit of a shock to you, and honestly, I kind of sat here and I looked at it for quite a while because Calvin Ridley has been fantastic this season, right? I mean, really at the beginning of the year, he held things down. over the first several games of the season. Actually, if you look at weeks 1 through 5, if it wasn't for a week 4 performance where he had 5 targets and no receptions, the dude absolutely dominated everybody. 130, 109, 110, 136 yards. He had 4 touchdowns during that time frame. Of those 4 games that he had 100 yards, he had double-digit targets in all of them. Since then, though, week 6, 7, and 8, he's gone 7-6, 61, 7-5, 69, 4-3, and 42. Why is that? What is part of the reason? I mean, there has been issues this year with Julio Jones being injured. There's been issues this year with other injuries on the team. Throwing the ball, it's been a little bit up and down, but there was a change at head coach. And with that change at head coach, there's been some changes to the philosophy of the team as well. We've seen Atlanta get a little bit better against the pass. Their defense has been a little bit better over the last couple of weeks, which isn't saying much considering how bad that they were to begin with. But then the usage of Calvin Ridley's gone down a little bit as well. Now, Julio Jones being back and 100% healthy obviously is something to consider with that. But now, not only that, but you've got Calvin Ridley coming up with some pretty strong matchups. The LA Chargers are going to be coming up. The Tampa Bay Bucks are going to be coming up twice. And the Kansas City Chiefs. Those 3 teams, all top 12 in fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. Now, he gets the Saints in week 11. And then in week 12, okay, so you got the bye in week 10, so we're good there. Come back week 11 against New Orleans. Then they've got Las Vegas, and then they've got New Orleans again. So it's not going to be until a little bit later that these matchups start becoming an issue for Calvin Ridley. But the one thing, too, that we need to be keeping an eye on, his foot. Is the foot going to be causing issues for him moving forward? If you were going to try and trade him right now, if you thought to yourself, who can I get for Calvin Ridley? That's where what I said at the beginning kind of comes into play, because if you're trying to make a trade right now, you may be making a trade where he is at his lowest value. Because if you look at it, teams are going to be saying, or opponents or owners are going to be saying to you right now, well, look at his last couple of games. Now he's got a foot injury. They're going to already have some of these things stored up. Unless you get someone in your league that you know doesn't take a look in depth at information like that, you're probably going to have to do a little bit of work to make this move. Now, there's some guys that you could end up making moves for. I mean, you could try and trade a Calvin Ridley for something like a Terry McLaurin, right? I mentioned trading for Terry McLaurin in my video last week. He's a guy that's being overlooked basically because of the team he plays for, but he's the wide receiver 11 right now. Calvin Ridley is the wide receiver 6, but there isn't too many points per game separating the two. Terry McLaurin has 14.1 fantasy points per game, and Ridley has 15.8. So they're really, really close to each other. So maybe that is an option for you to take a look at. Maybe you can make the move for, say, like a Tyler Boyd plus more. Maybe take a look at my trade targets video and say you could trade Calvin Ridley for like a Tyler Boyd plus a running back of some kind if you're dealing with any issues right now at the running back position. Like a Miles Sanders, for instance. Miles Sanders is supposed to be back very soon. Maybe you capitalize on a James Conner coming off a poor performance, something along those lines. So again, at that point, you're not trading Calvin Ridley for just a bunch of depth that you may or may not use every week, but you're trading him for somebody that is close to him in value at wide receiver, and you're getting a little bit of a bump elsewhere. So, Calvin Ridley, again, keep an eye on the foot issue. Maybe we're not making the move right now because we're in the bye. Give it a week. When news starts to come out that he's feeling better, then at that point, let's go ahead and make a move. And we've seen these with these wide receivers in the past. These foot injuries can linger for a little bit. Couple that with the tough upcoming schedule and the fact that he has kind of moved back to the wide receiver 2 status on that team instead of the wide receiver 1 status. You might be able to get a little bit more for him than what he can offer you the rest of the season. For my next trade candidate, a guy that is right there in Atlanta with Calvin Ridley, it's going to be Todd Gurley. Todd Gurley, this is a tough one also to swallow. We'd like Todd Gurley coming into the season. He was the guy that we were telling you to definitely get at his value. It was hard not to buy him. Right now, he is the running back 6. But the one thing that I can tell you with Todd Gurley is that sometimes if you take a look at the numbers, they're a little bit misleading. Right now, Todd Gurley, yes, he is the running back 6 in fantasy points, but he is also basing a lot of that off of touchdowns. 9 touchdowns in 9 weeks so far. The one thing that I try to stay away from is buying touchdowns. I do not like to rely on touchdowns, especially if you're looking at a guy being your running back 1 or 2. Maybe that's what you're looking at with Todd Gurley. Maybe he's your running back 2. Okay, that's a little bit different. If you've got someone really good as your running back 1 that's helping you, that's all right. If Todd Gurley is your running back 1, again, maybe this is something that you can take a look at, and I'll talk about it more in just a minute as well when I talk about my next candidate. But again, maybe there's some people that you can take a look at where you get a pretty good option in return plus a little extra. But with Todd Gurley, back to this, he only has 1 game this year with more than 100 yards receiving. He's basically non-existent in the passing game as well. So when Todd Gurley used to be a guy that would put up major numbers because of his work in the passing game, this year he hasn't. His best game so far is 4 receptions. He's got a game with 4 receptions. He's got a game with 3 receptions. Other than that, it's 2-0, 1-1, 2-0, and 2. So he's not doing anything in the passing game. For those of you in half PPR and PPR formats, you don't need to worry about that in terms of value. Again, his touchdowns, 1-0, 1-2, 1-0, 2-1-1. So scoring touchdowns every week has kind of been his MO so far. This is where things get concerning, though, because when you take a look at the yards, and I'm not a big just pay attention to yards, yards after, or excuse me, not a big person that pays attention to yards per attempt. I don't like to look at strictly that, but in this case, it's a little bit concerning that when you take a look at the numbers and you say, oh, he's scoring all of his points from touchdowns because the yards really aren't there. If the rushing attempts per game were to go down or get more difficult, how much ceiling does Todd Gurley have on a weekly basis? Because his upcoming schedule has the New Orleans Saints twice. He's got the Tampa Bay Bucks and the Kansas City Chiefs. All of these teams are top 11 and fewest fantasy points allowed to opposing running backs. And this year, he has 1 game over 100 yards. Other than that, he has 1 game at 80 yards. He hasn't touched 70 yards. So only 2 games over 70 yards. And there's only 3 games in which he's averaged 4 yards per carry or more. Other than that, he's averaged 2.9, 3.5, 2.35, 2.74, 2.56, 2.79. So he is getting a decent amount of touches. He's getting right around 15 to 20 touches per week, okay? But he's highly inefficient. He's not getting any work in the passing game, and he's having to score touchdowns. And with these games coming up, the New Orleans Saints, the Tampa Bay Bucks, the Kansas City Chiefs, the one thing Atlanta is probably going to have to do is throw the ball a lot. And if they have to throw the ball a lot, that could really hurt some of Todd Gurley's value. Another running back that we're taking a look at, James Robinson. And this one hurts a lot. Because if you are a member of our Patreon supporters, I wrote about James Robinson way back in either May or June, I believe it was. I did an article on Patreon talking about James Robinson and how he was a guy to look at for fantasy value this year. So some of you that are supporters already knew about James Robinson over the summer, before Leonard Fournette was cut and released, before they sent guys to the IR. When Raquel Armstead was the guy that everyone was talking about, James Robinson was the guy that we were saying, hey, keep an eye on this guy. And he has absolutely delivered this year, the running back 4. Wow, that is crazy that this guy was off so many radars to begin the season and is now the running back 4. Okay. One thing about him is he has gotten a little bit of work in the passing game. He has multiple games with 3 or more receptions this year. So in half PPR, full PPR formats, he has gotten a little bit of work in the passing game. His yards per carry, not bad. Not bad. He has been over 4 yards per carry for the most part. He's got a couple of lower games. And he hasn't really relied on touchdowns either, though, because right now he's only got 5 touchdowns on the ground. He's got 2 through the air. So it's not like he's been very reliant on the touchdowns either. So this is a guy right now that you could actually, send over to people in an offer, and they might bite right away because there's nothing in the numbers that suggests to us that there's going to be a lot more difficult matchups to come, other than the fact that the schedule is brutal down the stretch for James Robinson. He gets the Steelers, the Ravens, the Bears, and the Browns. Right there next to those names, 2nd, 3rd, 12th, and 14th fewest fantasy points allowed per game. So, he's got Green Bay coming up in Week 10. That's the big thing. We're not trading James Robinson this week. Don't do it. Don't suggest it. Don't even consider it. You are going to play James Robinson against Green Bay this week 100%. After that matchup is done, and after he has a big game, you're going to float potential trade offers out to people. And James Robinson is probably going to have quite a bit of value right now. Okay? James Robinson is a guy that I have seen go in some trades to to players like an Aaron Jones. Like if you have James Robinson in a small wide receiver piece, maybe you can trade them and bump up to Aaron Jones, who I like a lot more to finish the season. Maybe that's one that you can take a look at. Again, maybe there's a Miles Sanders-esque trade that you can make. Check in with the Miles Sanders owner. Miles Sanders is probably going to be back this coming week. Let him get back. Let James Robinson have his big week in Week 10 against Green Bay. And then float it out there to the Miles Sanders. Hey, I've got James Robinson. I really like Miles Sanders. I need a little bit of help elsewhere. James Robinson for Miles Sanders. And maybe you can get like a Tyler Boyd with him, right? Maybe you can do something like that. Maybe you can buy low on like a DJ Moore or a Juju Smith-Schuster. Something along those lines you can make a trade for. Maybe you can get, a Miles Sanders and a Christian Kirk. If you're a Christian Kirk believer, maybe you can add him to your repertoire as well. Get him in your lineup too. So there's a lot of different options. Maybe you can take a look at adding some type of a tight end. Maybe if you're dealing with issues at tight end right now, maybe you can trade James Robinson for a running back and a Darren Waller. Probably aren't going to be able to get a Travis Kelce. He's a little bit more difficult, but maybe that's a move that you can make. So again, we're not making trades for these players for just pennies, right? We need other dollars, or we need 50 cents back in return, okay? 2 50-cent pieces. We need those things in return. I don't want you going out there and trading for 4 quarters. That doesn't make any sense. That's probably not going to help your team. And when you do something like that, you come back at the end of the season, you're like, oh man, I traded James Robinson. The idea when you make these trades and you trade these type of players is to get full value in return. So even if they end up still performing well, you're not regretting it because the players you got in return are just as good, if not better. Okay? That's what we need to focus on when we make trades like this. So there are several candidates for you to be taking a look at. If you own them, you could potentially try moving them right now at different points. Maybe you're not moving them this week. Maybe you're moving them next week. Maybe you are trying to unload them as quickly as possible. Keep an eye on your trade targets. Some of the guys I mentioned, can you go get them? And the video I posted last week, any of those guys, are you interested in trying to grab them? Okay, so keep all that in mind when you're making these deals. And first and foremost, too, don't make the first trade or accept the first offer you get. Let your entire league know that you've got these guys, you're interested in moving them, and then let them outbid each other, okay? It's fantasy football. Let them bid against each other a little bit. If other people don't like that, screw them. You're doing what's best for your team. So there you have it, Headliner Nation. Several options for you to be taking a look at if you own them, potentially moving them and getting some pieces in return. Do me a favor, hit that like button if you appreciate the content. Do you have questions on any players that you might be trying to trade? Let me know down in the comments below. And then as always, hit that subscribe button, become a part of Headliner Nation today. Appreciate it all. Thanks for tuning into this video. I'll catch you later. Stay safe, stay healthy, and I'll see you on the next episode of the Fantasy Headliners.